Does anybody understand what an alternate universe is? Does anybody know what a parallel universe is? Does anybody know what is a paradox, a paradigm, or polar shift from compulsories or location setting to travel? You know what that indicates in all that line communication setting to its system? What if I told you you're not you? What would you think of that? What would you say to that? Well, what does that do to your system, to your set lines, your psychonisms? What does that do to your egos? It inflates your systems that you're not attractions of, right? But how do you know what's real? How? How do you know you're actually you? How do you know you're not in a parallel? How do you know you're not seeing other versions of yourself? You don't know. To identify who you really are is to identify what's in position in your system, is truly understand everybody is in that transition of itself. And that's what we have to let go. And that lets go of all alter versions how we see ourselves in fractions. And the parallels that we put ourselves into the alter states of alteration. It's an allocated setting location to a system that calculates and modifies the travels to a direct location to its system. Now, processing that to really understand the mind of itself can take over the self. Now, if the mind can take over the self doesn't identify where it is in that position to its systems. It's an altered state how you see yourself. But you can't see yourself until you see the real version of you as you're sleeping in the metabed. Setting lines of communication system is a true lines of set lines of travel. Setting lines of frames. You guys live on 7 days a week. Setting lines of communication, 7 days of windows. And that process of communication setting all different levels, alter versions of you at different frequencies. So how do you define what is real, what isn't? How do you know where you are? How do you know what you're doing? And identifying these applications is to let everything go that you're not attractions of. The one thing you all have to let go in position location is the body itself of the transition that keeps you sleeping on its earth. And you realize you're already there. Transition is the transactions location setting that's already set up those equations. And that's why you guys have to get out of the fear itself. Now, getting out of the fear itself volumes everything that you come in position, location, and systems, bringing it back to who you really are. It's the dreamer. It's to control the dream of dreaming. And once you start doing that, you're no longer in the alter versions of yourself. You're no longer in the parallels or the paradoxes or the paradigms or the polar shifts or the compulsories or anything that measures scale or balance. Right? That's what you have to start identifying in that position, is to let everything go of what you aren't and to identify what you always are is everything of questioning nothing. When you get to the questions, everything comes to terms of what's going on in that position location to its systems, right? Everything's running right now. But what's running you? Because you're not running yourselves. You just think you're running yourself. So you're fabricating yourself in an image, and you're not understanding the altered state that you are in the mind of conceptual setting. But you believe that's real. You actually believe you're actually standing here, but you're not. You actually think you're sitting down. You actually think you're driving a car. You actually think you're downstairs. You actually think you're watching TV, but you're not. You're in your altered state of your own mind of conceptual setting. You're seeing a visual cortex that you put position location in your system. It's a plain audio mechanism location setting that's all lines of position that's running your system. And rewind, fast forward, and pause and stop, and freeze, and alternate, and set travels in communications. Those frames are in that position at all levels. And every time you get up in the sequence, in that all line communication setting, you're coming in different altered states of frame by frame by frame, of seconds, minutes, and hours. That's changing your system locations of where you are in your realities. And the altered state of itself is the altercations. The mind state that puts you in position location is the psychosis. The position location puts you in the mental capacities to the meta capacity that puts you in the emotional capacity of your spiritual capacities. So you can't divide what is real and what isn't. until you get out of something that you always are, the dream itself. Once you control the dreamer, you start dreaming, and you get out of the dreaming. Once you control the dream, everything changes in frame. And once you control the dreaming, you start controlling yourselves. The altercation system is the mind of alteration that puts the mind state itself in its parallels, that puts you in position location in your system. So you're not identifying what's going on in frame by frame, right? But what you're identifying is you're going through alternate lines of communications in universes, different galaxies, different space, different time, right? Different clocking, right? But you're not you. You're a fabrication of an image of you that thinks you. It's an imagination of you. The real you is sleeping. And the more we identify that, the more we wake up to it. It's time to wake up. All right, so we got set lines of grounds and 3 lines of measures and 4, setting sequence lines of 3 lines of calculation setting, process lines of high position location of system of 3, 6, and set position lines of travel. So it's set lines of 3 centers, direct lines of 3 center positions, all levels, and 4 communications and setting of travel. And set positions, all right? Okay. So we're going to cross the angles, lines, energize, course centers, catapult, catalysts, high course centers, lines of travel communications. Directing ground centers, 4 equals lines of 3, sets calculation lines of 3 over measure and 3 over scale and travel. Okay? Setting calculation ground centers in solar cell, directing ground centers, energize. Set course centers, flux over line, direct signal of subconscious, location setting of team line, units, and set position operators. Operation line sequence, everybody else would be outside line looking in, and every line communication setting with position location settings. Taking care of the subconscious and put you in position location measure and scale of communications. Setting track lines, directing ground center location system, all through tractions. Putting you guys outline sequence location the stream itself into the conscious location of what you are in settings, seeing the alter versions of you sleeping in the metabed interactions. Have fun. Done. That's it. So you guys got 40 minutes on Earth lines, which is 40,000 line seconds and minutes and hours. Set track course centers line position of 4-hour frame. All right, have fun. Now you guys are getting confirmation already because you've already been through this, but it's not through frequencies until you reach the communication system. So setting lines of track centers, the operation line calculation setting, 1118 line sequence here. Setting position locations where you are in your time frame is now in set position location system. All right, so these altercation lines, hallways are coming in attractions and direct signals, 4 lines of flux, 4 lines of measure and scale. Process N, that communication system of the travel and set attractions. All right, the hallways. Ground centers are 2 measure, 2 line rotations and moderating setting location to its systems. Travel point lines of graphs. There's the pods and set position and sequence. Okay, have fun. All right, so line setting locations and countdowns. We're in the line course centers and countdown screen adaptation and flux over screen location systems. So the reason why you guys have to start to identify these things is know exactly how to go through communication of its frame itself. But when you see the alter versions of yourself, and when you take out the subconscious of yourself, and you see the alter versions of you sleeping in the meta bed, everything starts to make sense. And then you stop lines of communication setting, asking questions. All right. All right, so we're going to hit position locations. You guys have your test, review, and evaluation to setting through operation. Okay, setting lines of centers has 1 signal line as a grounds. It sets position location, measure, and scale. Seconds on minutes, change the hours and frame, and set travel communications. All right. Have a dark ground of symbolism, cross line ground lines of settings. The operation sequence puts all communication system off through travel and travel communications. All right. High course centers, line direct signal lines of flux over line to 3 angles in travel communication. All right. Calculate and modify line screen adaptations as travel. Okay. Star mechanism lines of flights, high course centers lines of communication. Out signals, inside lines, track center location system, all through crop circles and direct location to its system. All right. 2x2000 lines of setting, process off communication setting of surface. Scan centers on 1-3 lines and position lines of 3 over flux over screen adaptation. Okay. Calculate and modify center lines of communication system, all through tractions, all through setting. Okay. Now we're going to ground the line centers of its platforms and all lines at equal correlation setting the communication system. This opens up all your towers of communications and tractions. They are right there in set position. Right? Then we coordinate, communicate centers, ground lines of service, and 3 communicates lines of angles. That communicates the setting of 3 communication system, all through tractions into your satellites and communication. I'll set up the equation. So you guys are just walking through your frames, monitoring system locations, intelligence is helping you out, showing you location settings. Try to understand what's going on with your system. It's going to be a very emotional day for you guys because you start to recognize what's really going on with your system. Is understand how to mind control your settings yourselves. Is to control the dreamer that you are dreaming. You realize it's not a dream. You change the altercation system, change the parallels and the paradigms of the setting location systems to the paradoxical systems. Recognizing that is knowing exactly what's going on in your mystical cortex. To your cerebros. Know how to identify the frames and what's going on with those 7 days a week and setting lines of travel. 7 windows and factors correspond locations at different line of alter versions of your systems. The imagination yourself is set positional location systems. So how can you identify what is anything in travel balance? You can't until you really see yourself where you really are. Waking up from that alone is controlling the dreamer that you are instead of the dream of the dreaming. Right? All right, so setting lines of triangulation lines of 1 over cross lines of 2 over 3. So that's calculation ground centers and the operation lines of sequence lines of communication system and travel. 4 angles of flux over settings of square roots over screen. Okay. Directing ground centers, the high line sequence at screen lines adaptations of travel. Crossing angles, 3 lines of measures, 4 lines of scales, and 5 communication system of travel. There it is. Pyramid activation, screen adaptations of flux. Okay. Charge mechanisms lines of setting lines of A tracks, set lines of B over C. We have a D line rotation, DX lines of 1. Process lines of 3 measure, 3 scale, 3 provisions of triangulations, communication setting of surface. Readjusting lines, alignment center location setting to imagination system all through traction. Directing webbing lines, light lines, dark lines, high setting scores, communication setting, configuration system of box frames. Now the direct line link, process lines of 6 AM and travel, direct signal location system, you're all coming into your own galaxies and travel. Constellations. 12 scales of 3 lines in Orion's belts, 3 angles of point lines of graph, 3 lines of measure, and 3 communication system all through 4 lines of flux. Okay, sets communication lines, and again, into your satellites, process lines of 3 angles of the communication system, standing in coordinates of all communication. Okay, done by equation. All right, the operation sequence comes all communication to its setting. Okay, inside through tractions. Okay, guys? All right, so setting lines of communication is the polarities coming into the infinity, the rotation, spin cycles, and travel communications, all right? Sets lines of solar sail, dimensional sail, solar graph sail, solar communication lines of graphical line communications, right? 4 previous lines of cycles and setting travels, right? Over sequence over pi, setting travels in communication system of these calculations. Ooh, very powerful stuff when you see that instruction. Okay. All right, so coming to the constellations, coming into the galaxies itself, guys, is very powerful stuff. Now, discharge line screens, 3 lines of signals and ground center locations in 3 centers. Orion's belt is going to split 3 communication system at surface, 3 angle points and 3 ground communications. All right. 3 charge mechanism lines of graph lines, center line communication lines of 3 centers, line position location, 4 lines of scale. Process indicates and setting, high travel communication setting to its all communication to its system off through flagging. Red flags, correlations of high communication setting, high travels, directing the line screen adaptation of communication setting and travel communications. Okay. High charge, supercharge, electrical line communication discharge. That communicates and opens all signal location system into correlation setting to its galaxy shift lines of anomaly. So you're in here, send lines, setting communication to its infinity rotation, into its question and travel. Setting communication inside communications and travel. All right, done by equation. Metric meters and scale. Galaxy shift lines of anomaly. Setting lines of track in that line rotation to its system. Allocates set lines and highest position location. Modification of grounds, a constellation system is a constellation setting in timelines and frequencies of timelines of scale. Sets coordinates over screen adaptations of 4 angles and 3 lines of flux. The operation signals in position locations in 2 lines of flux over screen. Calculate and modify is high signal location setting. Process lines indicate ground centers of service and 3 angles of point lines of graph and set tractions of all levels of its question. 2 questions lines of settings. Process indicate point lines, high centers lines of travel, in direction in locations and setting lines of down lines of service. Calculate and modify ground centers location setting in direct correlation to its system to its umbrella. Ground center lines of 1, 2, and 3 lines of setting, process lines, routers, course centers, line direct signals, and ground centers of service and travel communications. Okay? Okay, mothership crosses the angles and remote lines setting locations of recharge. 3 symbolism lines, course centers of 3 travel communications setting. X line, J line, 1 line surface. Sets communication high centers, high sequence location system is weather patterns of galaxy shift lines of anomaly. Calculate and modify the Oculus course centers into all calculation setting to aft into nautical course center location setting of the steering wheel. Directing ground lines of north, line position east, lines west, south, line north, east, line southeast, lines of west and south. It set travel. Sets coordinates and line position location of pi and generation screens. High signal lines of 1, process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4. Sets calculation ground centers, line communication setting, all through travel. Okay? Directing grounds, high centers, lines of all communication setting, metric course centers, line communication setting, 3 angles of point communication lanes and 1 graph and 1 traction. The operation sequence sets communication setting all through flux over line. Okay? I sequence lines of panels, 3 spectral goals, ground centers in line communication over crossing line in transitions over lines of earth lines of 3. Process lines of indicate lines of earth lines of 1, transits over screen. Sets calculation ground centers in location system into energize of communication setting high lines of surface. Okay, so we ground the centers, process the communication over line set position location new systems, right? Direct and redirect. Signal lines on right over left, left over right, sending position location direct and redirect line centers. Sets waving screens adaptations into alpha, delta, and theta, omega, and zeta lines. 1 enigma. Sets course centers that travels in point communication of graphs of interference of cosmic change and direct signals of angles. High signals, high lines of service opens all screen location system into your pyramid and traction inside setting. Earth set lines of course centers, that's a spectacle screen adaptations, high position location in your oculars. Directing into torical fields, setting lines of 1 over 2, process lines of setting over lines of sequence, 3 scales and communications. Directing 3 lines of voice lines of patterns and configuration of face recognition, process indication system, greetings and sending travel. High signal lines of 1 over cross lines over 2 over 3, process lines that indicate high position of 4 over 6 over lines of 9 over 12. Setting communication lines and grounds, the high lines of surface location setting your flywheel. Cosmic universal line connection setting to discharge, course centers in electrical line communication, and magnetic force line communication setting and travel. Process of the indication system, process lines of indication setting and road grass screens, adaptations of box frames. High signals, high lines connections go dark. Red comes in, right? All set calculation lines of screen adaptations. 1 signal grounds a surface of traction, 1/3 ground at the location of black. Sending offline signals into green, we set coordinates and communication to high centers of surface. There's all little chains of events in the screen adaptations of centers and 2 lines of communication. Okay? And then we change the time frame and line position location in the systems. 3 sun lines of rotation in 1 cycle. Moon comes in tractions in 1/2 center in set tractions. Okay? Sun and the moon together. So, we change the angle points and how we see the metric course centers in travel communications, in directions and settings. All that communication comes in high service and travel. Okay? All right. And we change the angle points at ground centers location system all through tractions. All right? It's like set position location through the emoji, screen adaptation settings into Elmo. Elmo! All right, so we ground the centers and high lines of service. We change the communication lines of grounds and high lines set position cases setting to the sun and the moon. Cosmic universal lines, streaming communication constellation lines, comes into all levels of Orion's belts. We go into invisible chart waves and 3 centers of travel. Set position 1, 2 line signal locations. Offline, downshift lines of anomaly, 3 lines of flux. Setting coordinates over screen, adaptation system to its probing and track correlation setting and travel. Setting calculation lines, constellation lines that come into the meteor shower, ground center lines of 1 over 2 over 3 over 4, 6 lines of 8, position location and system all through travel. Okay? Then we come into all correlation setting to purple screens, 3 lines of signals over cross location of 4 centers, measure and scale. Constellation line conditions that was remote, recharge its metric location setting into all core centers. Dream interpretation setting comes out outline signal, inline rotation system, all 3 tractions. Meteor showers coming in, flash line communication setting, constellation system to infinity rotation. Done by equation. Set calculation screen lines, adaptation of system, all 3 tractions. Indirect lines of grounds. Okay? All right. Change the angles of points and set position lines of travel. Okay? So this is how we open the cosmic universal line and location northern lights. High signal lines of grounds, high lines of service, and locations. Bringing out track center locations and moderation system off the travel. Right? You can't see it, right? Until you actually see it in set position. Okay? Very powerful stuff. All right, so the cosmic universe comes into Orion's belt, same lines of transitions over screen over pi. Over line sequence, we change the moon line service. Sets communication lines of time frame and measure and scale of communications. Okay, and directions. All right, that's set up through its equation. Now we add lines, centers, location system, all through the fabrication system of space, modulates and set location of time space, time measure and scale, bending space in one platform. The operation sequence changes the correlation lines of time measure. 1 bending travels in point lines of 2 over scale, 3 lines of measure, and 4 communication setting to travel. Offline, inside rotation system, and 3 calculation settings streaming. Directing ground centers of panels, line rotation to its rainbow. Directing ground centers across lines of 1 over 2 over 3 over 4 and 5 set position. Travel point lines graph, sonar echo line, 1 line rotation surface and travel. Calculate and modify downshift lines of anomaly and 4 line communication lines of travel. Sets calculation lines into your pyramid and travel communications and setting direction. There's your pyramid. Inside lines, cosmic universal system locations, comes in line cover descendants and flux over line at 3 angles of point communication setting through pi generation lines of 1, clocking lines of 2, and set calculation lines of high position location 144, set position lines of 72, 48, set position of 24, and 12 scales of communication system of 3 tractions. In set position, done by equation. Very powerful stuff when you see it on all different angles of 4 communications, guys. Okay, it's all set up. Remember, you're seeing already what you already know. It's all schematics, what's in position, but you get notification, 9 center locations, and confirmation. Tracking numbers. All right, we have equals lines of 7 over lines, 7 over sequence, 7 over pi. Set position. Truth narrative, 1 center. Process lines into negative over lines into 3 angles. 3-point graphs, 1 center operation, and 3 centers of t over 7 over traction. Now, this how it line signals is a pi generation line screen adaptation of Cosmos. Process the indication is 7 lines of angles, 7 line streams, and 7 lines of travel. Okay? It's calculation of 4 grounds, position of box frame, triangulation of ground center location system, off the constellation setting of travel. It's calculation line screen adaptation of its dimensional door centers location to its system. High centers of charge, securing lines of measure and scale, and process communication. And now 1 symbolism. Dimensional door opens up at 3 angles in travel. 1 position, 2 position, and 3 lines of course centers into an open ground surface and travel communications and setting. All done by equation, right? All right, so we center line the grounds and high lines of sequence and ceiling lines of panels of the operation system and moderation. Travel point lines of the pyramid, process lines of indication of astral travels, astral connections, astral projections, and 4 signals, 45 lines of flush and 3 lines of angles and travel communications. Directing ground center lines of service, high signal location system, time frames and center location to its wall sequence. Sending travels a point communication system. XC1000 comes above flush, calculation lines of E factors, tri-screen adaptations of 3 centers of travel. Sets calculation lines of ground centers, offline communication, inside traction, inside line rotation, surface and travel. Sets calculation setting and ground lines and surface and set directions. There you go. Boom. Down by equation. So remember, you're just seeing schematics that's already in sequence. You know exactly how to come into the northern lights, the constellation setting, location setting, to magnetic force, into electronic interference, into discharge magnetics, set lines of communication to its metrics, setting course center location to its social line communication to its system, sets lines of media outlets, course centers of inner spectrum, outer link, outer line, out communications. Now we have 22 line frame, and setting course centers 11 channels. Operation lines, X line 1 in process lines. We take the line sequence, setting lines of travel, directing lines of 26 over scale, puts position location setting into 20 seconds over frame, and set tractions. Directing ground centers, flux over line into inhibitors over 4 factors, setting 4 lines of panels and travel communications. Sets calculations, green lines, adaptation setting. What does it say in line communication setting? 5 sequence energies lines, operation lines of cosmos. All right. So the setting lines into the hieroglyphics comes in high line screen adaptations. Set position, location, measure, and scale. Process communication lines of point graphs, 1 center, 1 line signals into point communication lines and 1 line sentinel position. Change the angles of point communication system. Change the telegraphic inner line centers lines of 1 sequence lines of 1 panel. Process indication setting, process communications in 1 line equals lines of 1 line signal into 1 graph communication of bracket. Directing ground centers of service in a 45 line set location setting, adds lines of equal line course centers and 1 lines of equal lines in pattern. Sets operation line sequence and 2 patterns of communication setting, a road graph, screen adaptation and systems, all through an E factor, line communication, 1 pattern, 1 positional point graph, and 1 level. Subtract lines of 1 center, line position of vector over screen, directing set location system all through travel. So it's calculation ground centers in an operation C location setting. 7 lines of measure, 0 calculation lines of E factors over 3. Sets track and course centers, line communication lines of 4 lines of 0, 0 lines of E over 5. Sets calculation lines of 2 lines of 6 over lines of 0 over 7. Sets calculation lines of high cell location setting into 2,600 and 0.7 lines of set position of seconds, minutes, and hours. Sets calculation ground centers into QR codes, directing line settings, high operation sequence, in location system all through travel. Sending constellation lines of 3 measurements and scales into quantum interference and set tractions. That my equation. All right, setting sequence lines of panel is a process communication X lines of 1. Now the X line of 1 says process lines of 4 panels of 1 setting, process summer, spring, winter, and fall interactions. Ground centers lines of service, process lines of 2 angles and 3 lines of measure and 4 lines of scale. All right. Sets calculation setting and online sequence location setting. Waiting 20 seconds. 20 seconds lines of 1, 20 seconds lines of 2, 20 seconds lines of 3. Calculates and modifies the ground lines of 1, and process lines of 2, 3 lines of 3 lines of 4, and measure and scale. Sets calculation ground centers, inside travels, and 3 lines of angles, and position on 1 graph communicates inside tractions. Sets calculation high center location system. Sets lines of center, operation lines of sequence, on position location setting, inline, outline, rotation of 4 fluxes, and 4 sequence, and 4 panels of operation setting that opens all scales of communication constellation system into the northern lights and travel communication setting, I receptor and travel. Okay? Setting calculation ground lines of setting and travel communications. All right? That's done by equation. So everything set up is already set up for you guys in moderation. All right? All right, so we go through a triangulation force lines of T factors and 3 centers of measure and scale. All right? Then we change the pyramid activation screen lines into 45 lines of sail. Set sequence lines and panel communication lines of its kite. Records time, setting course centers, and 3 lines of measurement and 4 communications. Directing calculation lines and solar's line communications, setting lights, shades, and shadows. Water sequence comes in high above the system. Subterranean screens adaptation of water line course centers. Sets lines of 1 to 115 lines of measure and scale of communications. Directing underwater line rotation. Sets calculation lines and galaxy shift lines of anomaly and set position lines of travel. Sets calculation lines in wind factors over line in galaxy communication setting 111, position 112, 113, 114. Summer, spring, winter, fall, 1 center, 1 operation, 1 sequence, back in center, back in sequence, back in panel, back in operation set, location, system, all through travel. Done. All right, there's your galaxy line screen adaptation setting, constellation system, all through travel. Modification line sets star routes. You got star lines of 1, star lines of 2, star lines of 3, and set tractions, right? Remember, this is nightline sequence. So if you look outside, it's dark. It's not light. Doesn't matter where you are. Timeline sequence is not dark because it's inside provision, how you see the vision. My conceptual lines of 3 angles, 3-point lines of graph, 3-line scales, set position, location of travel. Calculate and modify lines of 3 angles of point lines, 1 mothership inside rotation system. Sets calculation and ground centers, lines of service of 3 lines of 4 angles of travel communications. Sets lines of time frames and wall sequence of 4 panels of communication setting to an open door frequency and free lines of set coordinates lines of travel. Calculate and modify line rotation system to an open window that aligns the setting location setting to a TV box and 4 frames in the communication system. Set position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines of 1, 6 lines of 3, 6 lines of 8, 12, and 14 in travel in channels of operation screen. Directing ground centers and line communication setting adds flux over line and direct signal lines of grounds. High signals, high communication, high lines of set position location measure. Black holes, dark matter, directing signal lines of grounds, overline sequence over through pi. Done by equation. All right. Knowing the mechanism lines of time measure is in the seconds, minutes, and hours. Now we change the seconds into all levels. So seconds are now meters, minutes are hours, and hours are frame. Okay, that's where we are in tractions right now. Okay, so it adds line e-course, 3 lines of fluctors, flux over line into flush, directing ground centers, lines of service. Unification lines of network lines, scales, position lines of program. 3 indicate lines of graphs and primitives over line scales in position 1, 2, 3, and 4 over lines of 5, 6, 7, and 8 in set position of cerebral over set lines of 9. Travel point lines of graph is 1, 2, and 3 lines of 4 in set position lines of travel. Sets calculation ground centers and high lines of service in process of 1, in process of 2, in aerodynamics, graphing screen adaptation of Schumann resonance, crossing angles and point lines of graph and center communications. All right. Directing ground centers into high signal correlation setting and travel. Done by equation. All right. So now you know what the seconds, minutes, and hours are now. Center communication of the seconds and the metrics of its meters is known in the mind of collaboration system that puts all lines of your MK ultras, signature lines of patterns, directing lines into alpha, delta, theta, omega, 1 zeta, gamma, 1 sigma, Moran rotation ground centers, high lines of server location system, 3 center core centers lines of travel communications, energy charts, waving charts, magnetic forcing line communication lines of charts, high signal lines of grounds, high lines of service. Process lines of E factors over screen adaptation to the setting of 3 modulation setting of platforms. Platforms over line, course centers, signature lines of patterns, and 3 scales of communication system through all communications to a map from center calculations from grounds to center operation lines of space. Travel point lines of graph in question is downshifting lines of anomaly in line position location system. Question above in line course centers is space anomaly. Setting travels in point lines of graph. Indicate lines of 3 and cross lines of 4 over set. Process lines of indicates 3 graphs communication inhibitors over screen adaptation over cross location of angles of platforms of communication setting of traffic communications. High centers of platforms at line screen adaptation inside track communications. High signal lines of grounds set lines of Schumann resonance over line communications and travel. So it says calculus lines. Mothership comes in, 1 signal, 1 ground center, 1 service location system. All calculate and modify. Energize line condition setting, take the team in units, back to center operation and setting, in operation sequence, in time frame where they are, in track communications. Now you're out of the equation. Boom. See? Disappeared. It was there, disappeared. Now you're back in position, back in sleeping, in set travels. Into the pod is communication. Taking you out of position of consciousness, putting you back in consciousness, patience, where you are in the alteration setting of yourselves. Booyah. Done by equation. Very powerful. We just got into position attractions, guys. So I hope you guys had fun. All the versions of yourself. And it's all done through schematics. Okay? All right. Now, I know there's a lot going on with your minds right now because you're just saying, whoa, ortho versions I just saw myself. I can't believe that. So sir, do I have to get out of the ultra version I'm not? No. Just come to know what you always are. Just get out of the dream, what you're not. And the position of the dreamer, what you aren't. Because the dreamer that you're not is the dreamer that you are. Because you're not in a dream, but you have to control the dreamer before you understand the dream, but what you're dreaming in that position. So there's a lot of things you've got to get into modifications of and travel. This helps you in all ways and forms how you start to see the alter versions of yourself in real-time measure, in real-time scale, existing and just evolving and expanding yourselves. Right? All right, so that's how it's set up in set position of sequence or screen. Very powerful stuff, okay? Incredible when you understand what's going on with the alteration system. Time measure to scale. Try to send one center line service. Process lines of indication system through an energetic graph and setting a travel, right? And then more you understand the tone line, the direct coordinate centers of gravitation lines of pole is a walking screen adaptation of flux over cross lines. So the actual energetic graph line, you Schumann resonance guys, is just basically a set communication system through travel. So it sets position locations in one line centers, indicates lines of flux, 2 signals, 3 grounds, 4 lines, communication holographic line screens into AVR set location. Latitude lines, grounding lines of 1, grounding lines of 2. Okay, so your highways are getting a lot more complicated now through waving screen adaptation, right? Process the indication system all through travel, okay, through track correlations of its webbing. So ground lines, open lines of sequence has a dimensional door line that opens line ground center location to a system, the 3 communication setting that work across the communication system through webbing sequence of light and set lines of travel of communication. Okay? So I know exactly how this sets up in travel communications. Okay, how you set that up. Webbing lines of 1 over cross line, computer framing, direct calculation line, position location of travel, and direct signals location of grounds. The open sequence location system, all lines of travels and travel communications and direction. Okay, so waving lines of screen adaptations of all line communication setting of travel. Okay. Okay, so the open windows opens line inline rotation, calculated setting and constellation centers and galaxy shift lines into your northern lights, right? So that's communication high grounds and high lines of service at position location measure and scale of communication, right? Now this opens up the panels. The process of communication is the simulation ground centers into cross locations that puts you into the eye division location inside tractions. There's your eye in center position, right? That's the eye itself, right? Very high rise. So you synchronize your Fibonacci is going to 3 angles setting split lines of anomaly communications, right? All right, setting web and screen and adaptations to your constellations of 1, process of 2, angle lines of 3, angle lines of 4, and set travel communication. Remember, it's all inside the eye, guys, right? So that's the position of what's going to happen 6 a.m. The eye itself is going to come out the eye itself. So it's direct and redirect, but the process of communication is near side and far side at the same time. That's all it is conversion. So you see your triangulation, and you see your box and travel. Okay, setting lines of communication system. 6 a.m., direct and redirect in set position location in the system. Okay? Oh yeah. Right? It's very powerful when you start to understand what's going on. So once you get in that position, then you can time frames. You get out of the box frame. Out of the mind itself, guys, synchronizes everything in travel. Security lines, defense lines, communication to its box frames, and then it opens up its dimensional frames of its window frames, the location of its door frames. There's the door. So the more you understand the eye itself, the more you understand what's going on in travel, right? 4-line communication to ground centers, process of 2 panels, 3 lines of signals, 3 lines of service of past, present, and future in set position of real time, right? It's all inside the eye line, right? But that's where we're coming into, right? In set position. It's coming into the portal of the eye itself, coming in its own wormhole. Sun codes comes in lines of high center location of its moon. Moon process communication of solar and dimensional sail. It runs all scales of the webbing system all through travel. Once it has a direct line link, the process of communication setting goes through its particle solar system around the eye itself in set position lines of travel in the communication setting, inline communication setting of seconds, minutes, and hours. But the seconds are now meters. The minutes are lines that correspond center location to a system, puts lines in high travel correlation setting into the hours, and position of hours itself is now the frames of a communication setting to the eye receptor correlation location of its reality of center operation. Ooh, that my equation. Inside traction, all through the eye. Isn't that wild what the eye is going to be doing? Coming into its own portal. You in the center operation right there, standing. Right? Just try to imagine the eye itself, the mind, the body, the operation of itself, the deposition, the part, acceleration of itself as you disappear into the atmosphere of itself, the energy, the vibration, the communication, the frequency of the harmonics, setting communication, the body, the part, the acceleration system, just blend into the atmosphere, come in the atmosphere itself. Come in actually the energy of itself, the earth itself, the air of itself, the water, the fire itself, the earth line communication, and the heart of itself. Morph it into all communication in the eye line set, correlation setting, come to the constellation setting, and travel communications. So you guys will no longer be seeing the sky grid, the sky lines, nothing be blue, you'll be seeing the galaxies. Congratulations. 6 a.m. and travel. Okay? All through equation. All right? That's it. All through tractions. All through setting, all through operation. Okay? I'll see you guys in 5.